Great.
Before we get started, we're going to pass around this jar of nails. Please take one and pass it along. Have you ever seen bed sheets that are dyed in walnut ink?
Or work gloves that have had hands in them and worked so long that they've been worn through.
Or cars that have stayed in the same place long enough so that they have trees growing all the way around them.
Or a barn whose center beam has fallen in.
This 100-year-old barn has fallen.
And we took the wood.
Barn raising.
And we're here tonight. I'm Amber, and this is Katie, just to reiterate. And we're going to talk about the way that we approach material and experience, the archive, and the repertoire. And we're going to do that through talking about our practice and the result of our research process.
So the first section that we're interested in is the notion of the archive. Cultural theorist Diana Taylor describes the archive in this way. Archival memory exists as documents, maps, literary texts, letters, archaeological remains, bones, video, film, CDs, all those items supposedly resistant to change. Archival memory works across distance, over time and space. What changes over time is the value, relevance, or meaning of the archive, how the items it contains get interpreted, even embodied. Bones might remain the same while their story changes. Insofar as it constitutes materials that seem to endure, the archive exceeds the lived.
So when we go into an archive, and these images that you're going to see are from the archive, a little room at Illinois State University that is ferociously guarded by a woman named Joanne. The boxes in this room go from floor to ceiling, and there's exactly one woman who has a sense of where it is. And developing the access to this archive is also about developing a relationship with this woman named Joanne. And the first thing to do is to get access to first see the archive, and then access to have permission to use it. And that is the beginning of a relationship of figuring out how a project is going to start. And these are in random boxes, which are marked with certain things, and then you get to that box, and that's not what's in that box, but she knows that there's another box that has images of those, and it's really about this kind of unknown search for what we might find. Diane Taylor also talks about the repertoire, which is a different kind of knowledge. And this is a brief quote from her. The repertoire enacts embodied memory, performances, gestures, orality, movement, dance, singing. All those acts usually thought of as ephemeral. The repertoire requires presence. People participate in the production and reproduction of knowledge by being there. As opposed to the supposedly stable objects in the archive, the actions of the repertoire do not remain the same. The repertoire both keeps and transforms choreographies of meaning. Dances change over time, even though generations of dancers swear they're always the same. But although the embodiment changes, the meaning might very well remain the same.
We met a man named Ron Wolf who showed us around his apple orchard in central Illinois, and he showed us how to graft trees. He showed us trees that were two different types of apples on the same branch. And there we sort of see the mark of where the graft was started. These are ways that there is lived knowledge. His knowledge is being transported to us and not learned through a text or through material history.
And so we're going to talk about the first project that we did together, which was entitled Pastimes. And it started from a very simple question. I had a studio at Illinois State University, and I stood in it every day, and I asked, what's happened on this ground before I was here? And that began a long search into the archive of what existed. It also coincided with the university's sesquicentennial. And as I went to research institutions and pinned maps and images on my wall, a relationship began to develop with the gallery, and they asked to do a proposal for an exhibition, in which I invited Katie to join me on. And so some of these images that you're seeing are images of a present time. This is the street outside my studio, together with one of the images of the trolley that had run through the building that I had was given access through with working with Joanne.
So we found out that the space that the art building existed in had been an athletic field. A trolley had run through it. The marching band had used the space for most of their performances. And we were wondering how might we transport this knowledge to our viewers. So one of the things we started thinking about is what are the ways that we experience views? What are the ways that we experience spaces? So we developed these series using ViewMasters. Do you guys know, have you ever seen a ViewMaster and used one? The old people in the back have.
Yeah.
So these are ViewMaster images that we made for viewers to the gallery to come. They could come and check out ViewMasters and walk around the space and sort of be in the actual space and then see through these images. People can please come in and
have a seat. There's lots of space. There's a whole blanket here that doesn't have anything on it, anyone on it. And this superimposition of various time frames where past and present are activated is something that is intrinsic in the way that Katie think about this open-ended practice of culling research and not knowing necessarily how it's going to come out, but we do know that we want to find ways of conflating time and experience.
So this exhibition was 3 rooms, and we used each room as a way to sort of unveil this different ways the space had been used. So the first room showed, it had the ViewMasters that people could check out, and then it also had a drawing installation of these drawings that represented the first 47 graduates from the university.
And it talked very briefly about some of, even in that time zone, the Civil War broke out the year after Illinois State came into being. And so there were only 4 diplomas on the back. And we were able to find one of the original diplomas and were able to do an image transfer. So that was very exciting.
This is the second room, and in this room we tried to let all of the different uses of the space coexist in the same area. So it had been a football field, it had been a tennis court, it had been an archery range, it had been a trolley, and then it had been an art space. So we installed all of these different things together, laid a 3,000-pound wet clay floor so that the viewers, their footprints also were left on the space. So that at the beginning of the exhibition, the floor was perfectly flat and clean, and folks could walk over it needed to walk over it in order to get to the last room.
It was an odd hallway room, so we decided to activate that. And in this last room, you'll recognize that image from the archival search in the beginning. We searched the archive, and then we also conducted more than hundreds of interviews of people who knew about the building, people who had participated in the athletic department when women's athletics weren't funded before Title IX. All of these really interesting histories. And in these chairs, there's edited snippets. And so you have images. This is a blank ceramic plate. It's called, this room is called Souvenir, and it's a blank plate on which these archival images are projected every 30 seconds. And sometimes the stories that you're listening to would line up with the image but not necessarily the time. And sometimes the images that you saw and the stories that you heard didn't line up, but it was all about the space that you were sitting in. So Betty Reimer is the second exhibition that we did that worked with this particular question about sight, what happened in a particular place. I began my MFA program at the School of the Art Institute, and they had had for close to 20 years a gallery entitled the Betty Reimer Gallery. And being the curious person I am, I asked, who's Betty Reimer? And no one that I spoke to knew who Betty Reimer was. And this is the kind of thing where there's something very, very obvious and there's clearly a gap in knowledge. And I think, a project. Yes, this is it. This is gold. This is the material. This question between public information and enacted knowledge. So this gallery had been existing and performing without the person behind it. And I invited Katie again. This is the way we like to work.
So in this exhibition, we started talking to, we found relatives of Betty Reimer, and we started talking to them and talking to people who had used the space over its 20-year history, and tried to understand who she was, what her life was like. And we found this really interesting piece of information was that she had diabetes, and over 32 years, she had 32 surgeries. So we found 32 plates at thrift stores and printed information and text about her life and about her illness. Because at the time, so these are some of the images. So at the time, diabetes was really seen as a negative. Someone that we spoke to called it the AIDS of its time. And so she would hide her disease by eating tons and tons of sweets.
And drinking alcohol.
Which, of course, as you guys know, it exasperated the disease.
So this became, can you go back one slide, Katie? This idea of the fact that she was a very determined woman who kept a secret her whole life. She used to say she'd go on vacation and she'd go and have these surgeries, but she determined the way she lived her life. She bowled on 2 bowling teams and then would come home and not walk. She had 2 kids. She was told when she was 18 she was going to die. And she said, no, I'm going to live my life the way that I wanted. So you had this public persona of a woman who kept a private secret, and you had this public persona of a space that didn't know who the woman was. And so we were bringing these public and private spaces together for the first time.
Betty also, she was a painter, and so we were really interested in how her really amateur, Bob Ross style paintings were related to the way that an art space was being used by students.
Mm-hmm. And then simultaneously in this history was the history of the space. And so we had an event. We'll go to the event. We hosted an event in which we baked 32 cakes at the bakery of an audience member at the time, because a bakery called Backstory. If you ever want to work with food in a gallery, there's lots of restrictions, and so we needed a commercial kitchen, which was lovely. Thank you, Sarah Black and Backstory. But what we wanted to do was this mechanism that Betty had of eating cake in public became the mechanism by which her story was revealed. We had this very kind of gluttonous performance. We had an hour in the gallery where we invited the entire School of the Art Institute community to come and eat 32 cakes.
And in doing so, you can see her story was revealed.
So we're looking for these conceptual frameworks where the actual research content becomes practiced and embodied in the work.
The thing that was interesting about doing this project was that it made Betty Reimer very visible for a short moment of time to the community of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, but she still remained totally invisible to anybody. And if you type in Betty Reimer on the internet to try to find something about her, all you get are like all of these artists' CVs that say they've had a show at the Betty Reimer. So we were sort of interested in breaking that down. So we built a website that hosted all of these images and interviews and documentation about her, and then we invited people who were there to take home a little business card, slice of a plate, so that they could find out more. And then the last project we'll talk about is a project about Johnny Appleseed. And like most people, I knew a lot about Johnny Appleseed. It's sort of an inversion of the rest of our practices where we have found that there's something that we're interested in that we don't know a lot about. I had a lot of preconceived notions of Johnny Appleseed, as do most Americans. So on the left is an image from Harper's Magazine from 1871, article that was published about him while he was still alive. It went to print right after he died. And then the Walt Disney video of Johnny Appleseed, where he's sort of singing about his love of apples. That didn't really mesh up with what we found in our sort of lived experience of being apple eaters. And we were sort of curious as to, when we were doing this thing that we were told we should be doing, eating an apple a day, how did that relate to the history of Johnny Appleseed?
And so we again set up a practice where we weren't sure what we were going to do, and we began a huge archival search on Johnny Appleseed at the same time where we began this documentation of eating an apple a day and and saving the seeds.
So we saved the seeds and we gave them away in the same sort of practice of Johnny Appleseed. So we would take a photograph of every apple that we ate and then would make a little packet. Johnny Appleseed is known to have saved seeds, and for the best apples, he would give them to his best friends or the best people that he would meet.
And there's a really interesting curious thing about apples that we learned, which is apples are polyzygotic. And so if you plant an apple seed, you don't know what you're going to get. It's genetically combining to come up with anything. So most of the apples that Johnny Appleseed planted were not the apples that were for eating. They were actually primarily used for a little extra bit of flavor. They were what we would call crab apples, or for making alcohol. That was the primary use of all of these apples.
So you have an apple like this that has 12 seeds, and each of those individual seeds will make a tree that will taste totally different, right? So you have a red delicious apple, and you plant the seeds from that red delicious apple, and you end up with all different types of trees.
And so, of course, we had to do it. So we started planting apple trees, but at the same time, there's a very single, supposedly documented tree that is the last existing Johnny Appleseed tree.
It's in Urbana, Ohio. And so we contacted, there's an organization that takes grafts from famous trees all over the world. So we got a copy of that tree and started planting those together. So this is a project that won't really come to fruition for 7 to 10 years. That's how long it takes an apple tree to fruit. But we're giving those trees away to people and continuing to graft them. So then this way, there are stories of Johnny Appleseed where he might have gone all the way across the country. We know that not to be true. We know that he died in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and never went further west than that, even though people will say that he was in Oregon.
Yeah.
So we are sort of continuing to play out his history, right? So we'll plant these trees, and what we're asking is that everyone we give a Johnny Appleseed tree to, we also will give one of our trees that we don't know what it will taste like.
So the way in which Johnny Appleseed would have planted it, and the way in which we preserve this particular history.
So we also created a series of games related to it, and this one was the children's game Memory. Have you guys ever played that, where you flip over cards and when you get the two that match, then you pull those away? So we did that with quotes, images of apples, and also quotes about him, to sort of see the diversity of the ways that he was being understood.
And in this, he was portrayed as an evil capitalist entrepreneur who went ahead of all of the homesteaders, and he had an uncanny knack for finding where people would want to buy trees, and he'd start a farm, as well as a medicine man who could communicate with the animals and was a witch, considered a witch doctor in certain communities because he was able to communicate with the Native Americans in ways that other people couldn't, and all of these multiple histories emerged in this game.
And then the second part of the project, we decided to get apples from the store, so red delicious apple, the sort of apple that we think of when we think of an apple. And we also foraged apples, so sort of thinking about the way that Johnny Appleseed might have really existed with apples, right? So that there are crab apples and nice apples, and these are all from the Chicagoland area.
And in that basket are also apples named after Johnny Appleseed, the Jonagold, the Jonathan, all apples that start with Ja are named after Johnny Appleseed.
And then the apples on the left are apples that are called antique apples, apples that their genetic material comes from England. So they existed before the country existed. Johnny Appleseed was born in 1774. So he's older than the country, and so we were sort of interested in how he might run parallel to the history of America.
And when people brought grafted apples to America, and then the seeds began to spread.
So this is our latest project, barn raising, and we were interested in how barn raisings are shown in popular culture. So I became interested in this because I had seen this really, really weird movie called Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. Has anyone seen it? Yeah. More people in this room probably than ever before. So there's this really strange scene where these 7 macho brothers are going to a communal barn raising. And in the act of raising the barn, they get into a fight and the barn ends up collapsing. So we were sort of interested in the ways that collaboration is represented. This type of collaboration is seen as sort of idyllic, and how is that related to the ways that people really work together. So we started out knowing that we wanted to find a barn. And I happen to have a friend who he works in material reclamation. So we contacted him and we were like, this is what we want to do. Do you know anyone who might be able to help us? And it became this really interesting game where, like in all of our projects, we work with people, but it just became like that social sort of web became as important as the material and really spoke really nicely to the ideas that we were trying to think about, right, with collaboration. So John introduced us to Truth Hawk, who introduced us to Dave, who owned the property, or his sister owns the property, and he's the caretaker. And while he was the caretaker, 3 buildings had fallen down on the property. So caretaker in name, maybe. So we worked with them over a number of days to take a portion of this barn that had fallen and transport it here.
And it's really interesting when you engage in this process. Again, there had been a lot of our own back sort of history and research to get to this idea of we want to take pine and transform it into a social environment in some way. And so when we went and can we just quickly go back to sort of Truth Hawk's image? And so this is a dangerous thing to do. The center beam has fallen. We don't know at all what we're doing in terms of barn deconstruction or really laying subfloor, making a floor. And it's really amazing working with John and Truth Hawk, who this is their embodied practice. So Katie and I are running around like puppy dogs, struggling to get a nail out, while their level of embodied repertoire experience with this material, we're watching them and learning because this is what they do. Mm-hmm. And then what we hope is that kind of conversation about the repertoire and this knowledge then gets retranslated it's really wonderful working at Trinity because there are gallery helpers who come, and the entire time you're installing, there's people to help us. So the nails that you see that sort of archive the experience of us taking down the barn are from the barn itself, and then the community who's here to help us sort of re-engaged in this practice of construction, deconstruction that we're involved in.
So we're wondering what's next for this barn. We were interested that there's this barn that had fallen down in Wapello County, Iowa. Useful life was seemingly over, and we were able then to move that wood and bring it here. But we hope that it will continue to spread and continue to exist. So part of the project is that we're asking you what's next. So if you have a project or want to build something, this wood is yours. And at the end of the exhibition, we'll take it apart and divvy it out to anybody who wants to use it.
And in a sense, that's already happening. It was really exciting. Usually, if you're in Trinity Gallery, talks happen out in the hallway, and then you move into here. And once this platform was built, Cherith said, why don't we use the platform and bring the talk in here? And then right after that, the 60-second talks are sort of happening in here. And so in a sense, the question of what's next, you're sitting on it and making it happen. And that's really fantastic to see. And that's it. And if you're holding a nail and we haven't quite finished the floor. And so as a kind of, it's a symbolic gesture. There you'll get to kind of understand the sort of pattern and the structure. There's some drill holes. There's some hammers behind you. And it would be great if you could fold up your blankets and stack them in the corner.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
What's Betty Reimer's, how'd the gallery become named after her?
So, never wondered? You who never wondered? Well, Betty Reimer came from an extremely kind of, I would call it a lower middle class Jewish family. Her husband was a manager in meatpacking most of their lives. They, at one point, split up. Betty moved to Springfield to live with her parents to raise her two small children, while Barry took a management job in meatpacking in Chicago. In the 80s, Barry opened Reimer Foods, his own meatpacking industry. In 82, it went public, and that's the year Betty died. And 6 months before she died, when she was in the hospital, they became extremely wealthy. And she had always been passionate about art. It had been sort of her passion. And he was serving on the board. And so it was a memorial to Betty.
Could you speak about how you go about your collaborative pieces and then how you initially started your first piece, and which ones you decided to do together? Why?
Yeah.
Because you both work together.
So we worked together at an art space in Champaign-Urbana, and we met in 2005, we think. And the art space was called Open Source, and we spent a lot of time like having really fraught meetings to try to decide how shows were going to be curated and things like that. And so we started getting used to working together in that environment.
And part of that, and Josh was part of that, was that it was a democratic system. It was one person, one vote. It didn't matter how much labor you put into that process. If you were there, you were a full, active voting participant. And so it set up a kind of ideological framework for us in the sense of we would work together and we would collectively kind of have to come through debate, through debate and more debate. We would have to come to consensus. It's a super inefficient process in the beginning.
So Amber was a graduate student at Illinois State, and she called me up one night and asked me if I could build a website for this project that she was thinking about doing at Illinois State, because she didn't know how to do it, and I did. And I was like, well, sure, and we started talking about it, and an hour later, we had like totally changed the idea for the project. And then over the course of almost a year of working on the project, it changed many, many, many more times. So a project where originally I was brought in almost as a consultant role to sort of fulfill a task, then it became very clear that we liked working together and we liked fighting over like every tiny little decision. And since then, it's really been organic. So we'll find a project that seems like it is destined for the two of us rather than for our individual practices, because I think our practices are related to this, but a bit different. It just seems to make sense, right? So when it's a project that's meant to be for us, it's for us.
And the other thing I think that's interesting that's changed a lot in the sort of 7 years that we've been working together, and 5 as a practice where we do research towards an exhibition, is that in the beginning those arguments were, everything was at stake. It was new. It was new to us, and you know, where that nail hung in that gallery was so important. And working in this really open-ended way for a long time, I now, and I think Katie would agree, these opportunities when Josh Ippel calls and says, you know, would you like to do something? They're a breath, they're a moment, they're a pause, they're a comma in a sentence in a really large conversation that's going to go on. This research doesn't really have an end anymore. And so it allows us to synthesize what we've been doing and choose a format. It's not anymore the format.
And it's still, you know, we
Which is
both
great.
still have really different ways of working, right? So like Amber wouldn't work in video,
Probably
but
not.
I keep on wanting to bring that into our practice. So there are things that just, you know, we'll have an idea, and then the ways that we'll flesh it out really wouldn't be possible with each of us on our own.
Do the students, do you have any questions? Is this a practice you're familiar with? Does it feel new or different?
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
What was your favorite project to work on? Or what's been your favorite project to work on so far?
Your favorite project?
You know, that's a really hard, I think it's our favorite project? I think having the practice evolve, I think it's not the project, I think it's the way of working. So for example, from this, you know, Katie worked at an apple orchard out of sort of this research, and I have changed the way the space between the practice and the way that we live and what we do has this way of becoming elastic. And so it isn't really necessarily, again, about the precise outcome, but actually sort of what we learn from each other and from the research along the way.
Do you think it makes a difference that you're not in the same location with your work?
I think it's a benefit to us. We spend a lot of time on the phone, but it's really nice to be able to like send a version of something back and forth over the internet. I don't think a lot of the things that we do would have been as easy, you know, 10 years ago. But I think it works really well because one of us will see something and then we're able to say, hey, Amber, I have this idea. So I was, when we started working on Johnny Appleseed, I had just moved out to Massachusetts. And Johnny Appleseed was born in Leominster, Massachusetts. So it was like I was there and had this idea, and then it became a conversation that we needed to have. And the same thing with the 2 previous projects. Amber was there and saw something, and I think if we were experiencing everything at the same time, maybe that wouldn't happen as much.
Maybe, but it is hard. There are a few things where time has made it a little bit elastic, and you know, like any relationship, if you don't check in, you know, you lose a few things. So we've had to make some more consistent, like we must speak to each other twice a month. We just have to, or and then around an exhibition, around that kind of synthesis, we work together really sort of frenetically, but we do need a really sort of regular kind of checking in, or one of us gets too far ahead on a project and it becomes that person's project, and then we think of a new one, and that's okay. You know, that's just part of learning how to work like this.
Every artist finds satisfaction at different different places in the process. Sometimes it's the completed piece where the satisfaction comes in, but usually somewhere along the way where it's just, there's an itch or satisfaction that's being fulfilled. If there are one or two places that you had to decide on, in this way of working, where did you find that?
So the first project that we did, for me personally, I think was the longest project I had worked on. You know, we from start to finish, it was over a year, and that seemed like a really long time. Now I've been working on projects that'll take 4 or 5 years, but it was when we finished, both of us were like, gosh, we're so exhausted, and you know, like there's we were kind of, it was just like down in the dumps when it was done. And that seemed like that was just the way that it was going to be. And in this project, it felt like in the middle, as well as in the completion, has been really exciting. And that's, I think, part of the reason we really wanted to show the process in making the work and let the project evolve over the time that it'd be in this space.
I'll just quickly add, I have a different instance that I love. I love the moment when we come to synthesize and we have this, you know, like, well, what about if we do this? Well, no, wait, what about that? And what about this? And then pretty quickly, we solidify a solution to a question that we've just been presented with. And that moment before, you know, we're making anything, and before when it's all possibility, and then it just clicks and we know exactly what we're going to do, and then we move forward. I love that moment.
I'm curious about where you draw your visual language from, because the mode of production is not perfectly comfortable in a traditional art viewing sense. Or in a history, maybe, you know, all of these things, they feel like it's a way of like doing history or something. I mean, I would think of you two as historians as much as artists, and in some ways I feel like you're pulling from the history of like museum exhibition or something, maybe more so than an art gallery installation kind of thing. So I'm curious, at any step along the way, how you decide what moves you're going to make. You know, we artists all have a kind of language that we work within. Whether if we're a painter, we have our tools and our, you know, things that we work within, the parameters. But I feel like, you know, in some ways you've sort of exploded the parameters on traditional methods. And so how do you navigate?
I think part of the reason that happens is because we work in such different ways. Right, so Amber comes from a ceramics background, and I come from I mostly work in new media installation. So I think that's part of it, is that because we come from such different places, that this sort of ends up being a space that is really fraught, and that we have to really work over lots of decisions.
I think that I think you're cueing into the question of the museum. I think that there's two reasons, and this is true of all my collaborators, actually. We can work in really different ways and have really different outcomes, but Katie and I have a really parallel formal sense. We are both drawn to the way in which things are archived in museums, in the archive, and that formal language of how you order something, how you organize something, and tell a story. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. The beautiful thing about having an artistic practice is there can be huge nonlinear leaps in that, but between us, there is a very kind of, it's a logic. And part of the material question for me becomes very important. I think the most exciting thing about working with Katie in this early debates, where we were really learning and kind of testing with each other, was that the specific research began to dictate the material outcome. Mm-hmm. So Betty Reimer had 32 surgeries. That number 32 became the entire modality the entire form in which that project got presented. And it came from the research. And in that material in past times, that there had been a clay tennis court. And so we put wet clay on the floor, and there had been archery bows, so the hands were there. And Illinois State sold souvenir plates that were static, but that there's this internal logic between the research and the material outcome was tremendously exciting, and became a kind of guiding sort of philosophy.
When and where do you decide a project that you guys have been working on consider art?
Can you ask that in a slight? Let me see if I think I know what you're asking. When is it research and when is it art? Is that what you're asking?
When do you find it art within your research, like within doing the project? When you start considering it, okay, this is art.
I think that's a super slippery line, and that's exactly where I like to ride. I think I could say, and I don't mean this in any kind of flippant way, for me, it's all art, and it's all life, and it's all research. And the question is, when you pause and take these moments and have an exhibition, that's an opportunity to really jump in the deep end. I would say maybe it's like a three-legged stool, right? You have the experience of practicing what you're researching, you have the research, and then you have the visual modes that you're documenting that. And it's sort of like you can lean in different directions. They're all sort of happening at the same time. And most of our exhibitions have action, text, and image. That's the tripod, right? That's where we angle.
But it is an interesting and hard
It's
thing
hard.
when you're interested in, when you have research, and the research is the thing that's really exciting, and we want to be able to get at that and represent that and change it, right, in our projects. And sometimes the research is just so compelling that it's like, how could you make something that would be more interesting than that thing, right? Like, cultural history is just so, I mean, it's full of so many gems that it's hard to improve on it. And so it becomes this, I mean, it's the same, I feel like in some ways it's the same question as what happens when we talk about painting being dead, right? That like, well, we just have to do it a different way and sort of understand it in a different way and create a different lens for it. So I think that that's part of what we want to do. And Sarah mentioned that she would think about us as being historians as much as being artists, and I think that's really important. So to think about what we're doing as a different way of writing history or doing research, as well as being an artist.
And I think that one of the great things, one more thing, is that you have a lot of power as an artist. And it's like, you can take on different roles. I don't have a PhD in cultural philosophy, and yet I fully participate, in cultural production. I fully participate in that field, nor do I have any experience building floors. And so at every instance in the way that we go about things, we are learning what to do to articulate an answer to our research question. It's not a material practice where you start in your studio and you do something and you learn from doing it. One of the exciting things is I'm always learning from scratch. I never know. Many times I go into an exhibition and I have no idea how to do what I'm about to do. But I trust that I can learn it, and that's part of that research. I'm going to find out who Betty Reimer is. I am going to figure out how to build a subfloor to fit that little corner the way that I want exactly, right? And that's really exciting, that not knowing, and then working with people who do know. You've had great questions.
Thanks so much. We're invited.
Yes. You have nails?
Hammers behind
The
you.
hammers are behind you, and these floorboards are still loose, which is a serious problem, and we need some help.
Thank you.
See, you hit your thumb.
What? No, I don't want to.
Is there, I was assuming I was going into that, yeah. That is interesting. I just saw a hole and it was probably an old hole. But I definitely wanted to get one in this board.
Nice.
They drilled holes. You can
Connection.
those right now.
Ah.